When your own mother stabs you in the back, it doesn't hurt like a stranger's betrayal. It crushes something inside you forever. On the night before my wedding, I watched my mother raise a toast. But not to me, the bride. She smiled at my younger sister and said, "Honestly, I always thought you and David had better chemistry." People laughed. I didn't. I just smiled. Because she had no idea David was wearing a wire, and that I had bugged the whole venue. I remember being 7 and watching my little sister, Emily, throw my favorite glass snow globe on the floor just because I wouldn't let her use my crayons. It shattered into 100 pieces. I cried. But when Mom came rushing in, Emily pointed at me and said, "She dropped it." I thought Mom would see through the lie. He didn't. She turned to me and scolded me for being careless. I remember standing there, silent, confused, heart pounding, not because of the snow globe but because of how quickly Mom believed her. That was just the beginning. Emily was always the shining star in our home. She had this way of twisting things to make herself look innocent. Something went missing, it was my fault. If a chore wasn't done, I was the one who got grounded. If I did something well, she somehow made it about her. And my mom, she never questioned it. She would pat Emily on the head, call her my little angel, and then look at me with disappointment. Not anger. Just that quiet, heavy disappointment that said, "Why can't you be more like her?" Over the years, I learned to keep my head down. I became quiet, careful. I tried harder in school, did all my chores, never talked back. I thought maybe if I was perfect, if I gave no reason to be blamed, maybe then she'd see me. Maybe then I'd get a hug, a kind word, something. But it didn't happen. Dad was there physically but always distant. He'd sit with his newspaper or stare at the TV while Mom made all the decisions. Sometimes I'd catch him glancing at me when I was being blamed, like he knew I was innocent. But he never said a word. Not once. I wanted him to speak up just once. He didn't. So I started believing that maybe love had to be earned. Maybe if I was good enough, quiet enough, helpful enough, I could become the daughter she wanted. I didn't realize until much later that no matter how good I was, it would never be enough. Not because of me, but because she had already decided who the favorite was. Years later, after moving out and finally getting some distance from all the noise of my childhood, I started therapy. At first, it felt awkward, sitting across from a stranger talking about things I'd buried deep. But little by little, I started to unpack it all. The blame, the silence, the ache of always feeling second best in my own home. Therapy didn't change the past, but it helped me understand it. And that understanding gave me the power to build something better for myself. I found a small apartment in the city, started working full-time at a nonprofit, and even began painting again. Something I hadn't done since I was a kid. Slowly I stopped feeling invisible. That's where David came in. We met during a weekend community cleanup event. I was organizing supplies when he offered to carry a heavy box for me. I remember he made a joke about the gloves being too small for his hands and then smiled at me like I wasn't just someone in the background. We spent the whole afternoon chatting, and by the end of it he asked if I'd like to get coffee sometime. David wasn't loud or flashy. He was gentle, thoughtful. He listened when I spoke, really listened, not just nodding but asking questions, remembering the little things. He made me feel safe in a way I never had before. For the first time I felt like I didn't have to earn someone's love. It was just there, freely given. A few months into our relationship, I decided to introduce him to my family. I was nervous. My mother had always been hard to read, especially when it came to things that made me happy. But that night she smiled politely, asked him questions about his job and said all the right things. On the surface everything seemed fine. But I knew her well enough to sense when something was off. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. Emily was there too, of course. She'd grown into a prettier, louder version of her childhood self. She hugged David a little longer than necessary and made a few too many jokes at my expense. Harmless on the surface, but I felt that familiar twist in my stomach. She laughed a little louder around him, flipped her hair, brushed his arm when she walked by. But I didn't let it get to me. Not then. I told myself she was just being her usual self. And David? He was with me. He loved me. At least that's what I believed. At first I tried not to overthink it. I told myself I was just being sensitive, maybe even paranoid because of how things had been growing up. But as time passed, little things started to feel off. There was this one evening, a family barbecue in my parents' backyard. David and I had only been there for 20 minutes when I noticed him glued to his phone. He wasn't usually like that, especially not during family time. I leaned over and asked, "Everything okay?" He smiled and said, "Just a work thing, nothing big." But his screen dimmed too quickly when I peeked, like he didn't want me to see. Then there were the looks. Not constant. Just moments where I'd glance up and catch him watching Emily with a strange softness in his eyes. Not the way you'd look at your partner's sibling. The first time I convinced myself it was a fluke. The second time my stomach tightened. The third time I stopped pretending I didn't see it. My mother didn't help. One afternoon, while helping her set the table, she sighed and said, "You know, sometimes I think your sister would have been a better match for David. He's more lively. More like him." I froze, holding a stack of plates in my hands. I wanted to ask what she meant, but I already knew. I smiled tightly and kept setting the table. That's what I always did. Smile, stay quiet, push my feelings down. Emily, of course, had ramped things up by then. She started calling David cutie in that playful, teasing way. At first he'd laugh nervously, but he never told her to stop. She'd hug him a little too long when she saw him. Once she even sat in his lap for a quick picture someone was taking, acting like it was all just fun. I laughed along with everyone else, but inside something cracked. I kept telling myself it was just her being dramatic, just David being polite. I didn't want to be the jealous girlfriend. I didn't want to be the overreacting sister. So I brushed it off. I swallowed the unease and smiled through it. But no matter how much I tried to ignore it, that quiet anxiety grew louder every time we visited. Every time he lingered near her. Every time my mom said something that made me feel small again. It was all too familiar. This feeling of being invisible, of not being enough, of watching someone else take up the space that should have been mine. That night still echoes in my mind. We were at my parents' house for dinner again, just the four of us this time. David had stepped outside to take a call and I went to the kitchen to grab water. On my way back, I paused when I heard voices from the living room. My mother, Emily, and David, talking in hushed tones. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but something in my gut told me to listen. I stood just around the corner, heart pounding. My mother's voice was the first thing I heard, low and firm. "You still have time to choose the better sister, David. Don't feel guilty for having feelings. Life doesn't always go the way we plan." Emily laughed quietly, her tone too soft, too intimate. "You already know it, don't you? We just fit better." Then silence. A long, heavy pause. I waited for David to say something, anything to shut it down. But I didn't hear a word. My hands trembled and the glass of water I held started to sweat between my fingers. I didn't wait to hear more. I backed away and pretended I hadn't heard a thing. That night I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling for hours, questions spinning in my head like a storm. Was I losing my mind? Had they been sneaking behind my back all this time? And why wasn't David shutting any of it down? But instead of confronting them, I made a decision. I'd spent my entire life reacting. Always on the defensive, always trying to protect myself after the damage was done. Not this time. The next day I bought a couple of small audio recorders online. Tiny voice-activated ones. Easy to hide. And then I did something I'm not proud of, but I don't regret it. I told David I'd been reading a book about trust building in relationships. I said I wanted us to try something new. A truth day, where we wear recorders and talk to different people then play it back for each other later just for fun. He laughed at first, called it a little weird, but agreed. "Sure, if it makes you happy," he said, kissing my forehead. What he didn't know was that while he thought he was just humoring me, I was using this as my one chance to get the truth. To hear the things I wasn't meant to hear. To find out if I'd been foolish all over again, letting myself believe I could finally be someone's first choice. I waited 3 days after giving David the recorder before I retrieved it. He'd forgotten all about it, just tossed it in his backpack like it was nothing. Part of me hoped I'd listen and feel silly for doubting him. I wanted to believe he'd defended me, stood up for me, proved me wrong. But what I heard broke something deep inside me. The first recording started with my mother and Emily alone. They were in the sunroom, our family's favorite spot for tea and gossip. My mom's voice was sharp, clear. "You need to get him to stop dragging this out. He's still hesitating, but I know he doesn't want your sister deep down." Emily's tone was smug. "He's just being polite. I've always been better at everything anyway. It's just safe. Boring. The kind of girl you settle for, not someone you dream about." I clenched my jaw as I listened, my heart pounding. It hurt. No matter how many times I'd told myself I didn't care what Emily thought of me, hearing those words, hearing how casually she dismissed me, still cut through me. Then came the second recording. This time David was there. They were on the back porch. My mom again. You still have time, David. Engagements aren't binding. You don't have to marry out of guilt. Emily chimed in, playful. You could have so much more fun with me, you know. I wouldn't make you go to those boring charity events or talk about spreadsheets at dinner. And David laughed. Not just a polite chuckle. Real laugh. He didn't say yes. But he didn't say no either. He didn't defend me. He didn't even sound uncomfortable. He flirted back. Lightly but enough. Enough for me to know that I was never going to be his one and only. I paused the audio, my hands shaking. I wasn't going to cry. I had done enough crying in my life. Enough begging for affection, for basic respect. That night, as I sat alone in my apartment, staring out at the city lights, I made a quiet promise to myself. This wedding, it wasn't going to happen. But I wouldn't storm in and call it off like some dramatic movie scene. No. I would end it on my terms. My way. And when I did, they'd all remember what it felt like to underestimate me. The night of the rehearsal dinner arrived faster than I expected. We were in the garden hall of a beautiful restaurant. Soft lighting, white tablecloths, candles flickering under string lights. It looked like something out of a romance movie. Everything looked perfect, but underneath that polished surface I was carrying the storm. The room was packed. Our families, friends, people from David's office, my old college roommate. It felt like everyone who mattered was there. Everyone who had believed in this relationship, who had supported us. I walked in wearing a simple but elegant navy blue dress. I didn't need anything flashy. I just needed clarity. And I was ready to give it to everyone. Dinner went by in a blur of polite conversation and clinking glasses. I barely touched my food. My eyes kept drifting toward David, who sat beside me, casually laughing with my father. Then to Emily, who had worn a dress too white and too tight for a sister's role. And my mother, sipping her wine like the queen of the evening. Then the toasts began. David's best man made a few jokes, light-hearted and charming. My aunt shared a sweet memory about when David first met our family. And then my mother stood up, holding her glass with that same smug grace I had grown up under. She smiled at the crowd. I just want to say how happy we are. Though to be honest, she paused, giving a playful shrug, I always thought Emily and David had better chemistry. Some things just click more naturally. The room burst into soft laughter. Nervous chuckles. Emily blushed and looked down at her plate like she hadn't been waiting her whole life for this moment. I smiled. Wait, come. I stood slowly and walked to the microphone in the center of the room. Everyone turned toward me. I could feel David tense beside me, his eyes following my every step. I took a breath and leaned into the mic. Since we're sharing secrets tonight, I said, voice steady, I thought I'd join in. I pulled my phone from my pocket, tapped a few buttons and held it to the mic. The audio began. My mother's voice, clear and unmistakable. You need to get him to stop dragging this out. Emily's voice, smug and full of herself. She's just safe. Boring. The kind of girl you settle for. Then David. His flirtatious laugh. The room froze. No one moved. No one blinked. David's face turned the color of chalk. Emily's mouth opened but no sound came out. My mother, silent. For once in her life, completely, absolutely silent. Gasps rippled through the room. People looked at each other, unsure if they were supposed to react. I didn't give them time to recover. I turned off the audio, took one final glance at the table that had never truly welcomed me and said clearly, there won't be a wedding. But I do thank you all for finally showing me exactly where I stand. And just like that I walked out. The days that followed the rehearsal dinner felt like a whirlwind. The shock was still fresh in everyone's minds, the tension hanging thick in the air. David tried to reach out, sent countless texts and calls, but I ignored them all. There was no going back, not after everything I had learned. It wasn't just about the betrayal. It was about all the years of neglect, the lies, and the emotional manipulation I had endured. I was done. By the time David realized the gravity of the situation, I had already taken action. The day after the dinner, I had contacted my lawyer. We moved fast, too fast for David to keep up. The wedding was officially canceled. The venue, the guests, the plans, everything was wiped out with one signature. He hadn't even seen it coming. As if that wasn't enough, I pulled another card from my sleeve. A card no one had anticipated. I had known about my mother's financial struggles for years. She'd always kept them hidden behind the facade of a perfect family. The house, the fancy vacations, the dinners, it was all smoke and mirrors. Her mortgage had been overdue for months, and yet she never mentioned it to anyone. She thought she could control everything, that I would always be the good daughter who would come running when needed. He was wrong. Using a legal loophole I had carefully researched, I managed to buy her mortgage debt. I didn't tell her at first. I didn't want to give her any warning. I wanted her to experience the same sense of powerlessness I had felt all my life, watching her make decisions without regard for how they affected me. The eviction notice was simple. Straightforward. It wasn't just about money, it was about showing her the consequences of her actions. I wasn't just walking away from her emotionally anymore. I was cutting her off financially too. When she received the letter, I don't think she even understood at first. But when it hit her, she couldn't hide her panic. She tried to call me to plead, but I didn't answer. There was no point. I wasn't the naive, quiet girl anymore. I wasn't the daughter who would beg for love. I was the woman who was taking control of her life, finally. As for David, he wasn't done yet either. He showed up at my apartment one evening looking disheveled, desperate. He tried to apologize, his voice breaking with regret, but I wasn't listening. I didn't need his apologies. His words meant nothing anymore. He wasn't sorry for me, he was sorry for himself. You didn't just lose a bride, I said coldly, standing in front of him. You lost the only woman who ever trusted you. His face fell. I didn't look away. I couldn't. For the first time in my life I stood there, strong, unshaken, knowing exactly who I was and what I deserved. You lost everything, I added, my voice unwavering. And you'll never get it back. And that was it. I closed the door, and with that final click I severed the ties completely. There would be no more calls. No more lies. No more pretending. I had finally taken control, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me again. A month had passed since the explosion of truth at the rehearsal dinner. The dust had settled, but the consequences were far from over. Life had changed, dramatically, for everyone involved. My mother and sister, who had once lived comfortably in a house they considered their kingdom, were now cramped into a small rental apartment. The luxury of their past life had vanished overnight. The extravagant dinners, the designer clothes, the expensive vacations, it was all gone. All of it was wiped out when I bought my mother's mortgage debt. I had expected them to fight it, to beg for help, but they didn't. They were too proud, too ashamed to ask anyone. And honestly, no one was willing to offer a hand. Not after what they had done to me. The humiliation they had suffered was impossible to ignore. Our family members, the ones who had once praised them, had cut ties completely. They couldn't look at them without thinking of the betrayal, the lies, and the audacity of it all. It was their own doing, and they knew it. My sister, who had spent so much time pretending to be perfect, was now a shadow of herself. Her pride had taken a hard blow, and no amount of makeup could cover the guilt she wore on her face. She had tried to reach out a few times, sent messages apologizing, but I ignored them. There was nothing left to say. What was once blood between us was now a distant memory. And my mother? She was no longer the powerful matriarch who had manipulated and controlled everything with a smile. She had fallen from grace. The apartment was bare. No expensive furnishings, no lavish decorations. It was a far cry from the mansion they had once called home. The silence between them and the world outside was deafening. David too had met his downfall. It wasn't just about losing me, though that would have been enough. His professional life had crumbled as well. His boss had been at the rehearsal dinner, and the fallout from the public humiliation spread quickly. The recordings I played that night had been heard by more than just our families. They had been shared, talked about, and ridiculed on social media. It didn't take long for his career to take a dive. His boss, embarrassed by the scandal, let him go. One bad decision after another had led to his downfall. He tried to reach out to me, tried to explain himself, but by then it was too late. He had burned his bridges not just with me but with everyone who had ever trusted him. His apologies now felt hollow, meaningless. As for me, I had done something I never thought I would. I had taken the pain, the betrayal, the endless years of neglect and turned it into something positive. Something that mattered. I had started a women's legal aid group. A safe space where women like me, women who had been betrayed by their families, could find help, support, and a way out. We worked together to provide legal assistance, financial advice, and emotional support for those who were in situations similar to mine, whether it was a toxic family environment or the manipulation of a partner. It was my way of giving back, of turning my pain into something meaningful. When I looked back at everything that had happened, I couldn't help but feel proud. It had taken time, strength, and the courage to walk away from everything I had known, but I had finally found peace. I had created a life for myself that was truly mine. And in that small victory I realized, sometimes, losing everything is the only way to find yourself. I used to think that my silence was my strength. For years I had kept quiet, swallowed my feelings, and believed that being the good, quiet daughter would somehow earn me the love and respect I craved. I thought silence meant I was strong, that it protected me from the chaos and conflict around me. But as time passed, I learned a hard truth. Silence can also let people walk all over you. It can keep you small, trapped in a life you don't deserve. Now I don't stay silent. I don't shrink myself to fit into the mold others made for me. I don't stay in places or relationships where I'm not valued. I've learned that speaking up, even when it's painful, is the only way to reclaim your worth. It's the only way to show people who you really are, and that you will no longer let them define you. For years they tried to replace me with my shadow. They thought I was just a quiet, invisible figure in the background. They thought they could have my sister take my place, that I would just disappear without a trace. But they forgot something they will never forget again. I was never the shadow. I was the light. As I walk along this quiet beach, the sun setting behind me, I feel it. The freedom. The peace. I am finally free. Free from the lies, the manipulation, the years of being overlooked. I have become who I was always meant to be, and no one can take that away from me.